with his wrongful assassination in Bannack. We already have my introduction. What I'm going to let you know right off the bat is that the information that I'll be sharing with you from all the research that I've done is going to be much different than what you have learned and read over the years. So I will ask you to please keep an open mind as we go through Henry's story. There are 2 points that I would like to hit home really hard. We're going to be talking about Henry's life, mostly out west in California and the Western Territories. The one thing that I want to hit home to you is to remember that Henry Plummer was a real human being. He could be sitting in the audience right now. He was a real person with real feelings, real vulnerabilities, real goals, just like you and me. He was not a psychopath. He was not a split personality. He was not a demon, as Thomas Dimsdale had called him, but a real person, a real human being. And I was thinking, because I'm a visual person, whoops, I'm losing my mic here. If we can imagine how Henry looked, it might help us to kind of relate to him. And I'm not quite sure how this works. Because I'm a visual person, I like to see how people look if I'm talking about somebody or getting to know somebody. So, yeah. Brennan, I'm having trouble with this thing. And it's taking up my minutes. I think, yeah, duct tape? Yeah. Men use duct tape, women use a Velcro. Am I right? Is it going to work?
I think that's going to work.
Okay.
Does it feel loose?
I don't know. I can't feel it at all.
I think it's okay.
Thank you. Alrighty. But as I've been to so many archives and historical sites, both in Montana and in California, talked to archivists and historians, there are no known photographs of Henry Plummer. If you go online and you look up Henry Plummer, you're going to find a picture, it's a stock photo, of a villainous-looking man with black hair and black whiskers, and I can tell you 99.99999% that is not Henry Plummer. That is not how he's been described. There are no known photographs of Henry. Henry Plummer was an affable young man living in dangerous and volatile times. And as everyone, Henry made some mistakes along the way. If you can imagine Henry, and not just Henry, but many young men like him, came from perfectly upstanding families and followed the gold rush out west without really knowing what they were getting into. So Henry was no different. He came from, an upstanding family, and really, I'm really quite certain he didn't know what he was getting into. So, he made some mistakes along the way, but we all do. This here is a photograph of Nevada City, California, in 1856, and Henry was in Nevada City, California in 1856. He was 24 years old at the time. This photograph is taken by Julia Ann Rudolph, and she was a photographer, professional photographer at the time. This is the New York Hotel, which did not survive the Great Fire of 1856, and it was on Broad Street, which is one of the main streets in Nevada City, and it still is. Let's see. Okay. Move. Okay. Oops, went too far. I'm not used to your technology here. So I have zoomed in a little bit, and we're going to talk about Henry's description. I've got a couple of boards here that I'll be showing to you. One of these boards actually has a description of Henry from when he went into San Quentin prison. And so much of the description I've taken from the ledgers from San Quentin. 5 feet, 8.5 tall, which was a good height at that time. He had light brown hair, light complexion, and gray eyes. He was very handsome, well-groomed, meticulous dresser. He was polite, charismatic, educated, and intelligent. He was a man of few words, and one of the reasons maybe is because he spoke with a slight Eastern accent and always spoke in a low tone, which I think is interesting. From doing my research, I kind of got the idea that Henry was a little different than anybody else that came out west. He wasn't really a ruffian. He wasn't, like the miners. He wasn't. He was tough, but he wasn't like a ruffian. He was very intelligent, and maybe even more so than most of the people out west. And so I think he was a little bit different, and maybe that's why people picked on him so much, because he looked different and he spoke differently. So I had found this photo, and this photo is found on just about any website when you look up Nevada City or mining towns or anything like that. And this picture of Nevada City, California, 1856 is going to come up. And I found it and I thought, oh great, this is, Nevada City when Henry Plummer was there, 1856. He was 24 years old. And then I saw something and my heart started pounding and my breath caught. Do you see it? Henry Plummer was described as 5 feet 8.5 inches tall with light brown hair, light complexion. Now, nobody in this photograph is actually identified, so I can't say for sure. But if you want to try to maybe identify, have somebody that you can kind of relate to as a picture, do you see the face above the horses? Sure looks like Henry to me, just the way he's described. And notice that his hair is parted on the left. And in your packets, if you turn to page 7, you'll see a drawing of Henry Plummer later on when at the time that he died. Parted on the same side on the left. So even if that's not him, I don't know. It's somebody that we can kind of use and relate to. Alrighty. So most historians agree that Henry Plummer was born in Maine in 1832. He was very likely a descendant of Francis Plummer, who sailed to New England from Britain in 1634. Notice Henry's surname is spelled with one M. Plummer. At least 2 historians believe that he was born William Henry Plummer, and I believe that too. And there is also an idea that Henry was born Amos Henry Plummer, but I reject this because historians Mather and Boswell found an 1880 census from Wisconsin that named Amos Henry Plummer alive and well 16 years after Sheriff Henry Plummer's death in Bannack. Henry was the youngest of 7 children. He had 3 brothers and 3 sisters. And as a small child, he contracted tuberculosis, or what they called consumption back then. He was very intelligent, and since he was sick and frail, he spent much of his time focusing on his studies. So by the time he was an adult, he was very well educated. He helped around the farm, where he undoubtedly learned horsemanship and an ability using firearms, went hunting, I'm sure, for food for the family. But because of his poor health, he was not allowed to work alongside his sea captain father or brothers. I'm sure that hurt him. Once again, even at home, Henry was the odd man out, just as he was out here out west. But when Henry was 19 years old, he left home. And since he was familiar with shipping and with the sea, he sailed on a mail steamer off to the California Gold Rush via Panama. Henry hoped to find his fortune in gold, as many of the young men did back then. He also hoped to improve his health, his tuberculosis, in the California sun, and also demonstrate his worth as a brave young man. Frederick Allen, in his book, Decent and Orderly Lynching, talked about Henry when he was born, that not much was expected of him. And I think that's probably how he grew up. And I believe that he wanted to prove that he could do it. He could be a man, and he could be tough and strong. He was very sensitive about his courage. And if you doubt me when I say that, there's a letter here on one of the boards that Henry wrote to a newspaper in Nevada City because somebody questioned his courage. And he was quite upset. And if you have time to read the letter, it's quite something. He was 24 years old at the time that he wrote it. And if you read it, you'll chuckle because it does sound a little bit childish the way he writes it. But he was very upset that his courage was challenged. Alrighty, Henry then sailed from Panama on the Golden Gate, the SS Golden Gate, and arrived in San Francisco on May 21st, 1852. And let's see, where's my, whoops, I lost it again. Here he comes. This does not like me. Alrighty, I think I got it. Does it seem like I have it? Okay. So this is one of my prized possessions. It's the San Francisco ship passenger list. And I was so excited when I got this. It's got the Golden Gate. Departed from Panama on May 8th and arrived in San Francisco May 21st, 1852. And it's got a list of all the passengers, and this ship happened to be very overcrowded. There were not only people crowded in the cabins, but they were all crowded on the deck as well. So there's pages and pages. And I know you can't read it from where you're sitting, but can you all see the little yellow marker? This is passenger W.H. Plummer, which is really exciting for me. Spelled with one M. When Henry arrived in San Francisco, he was pretty broke, and so he found a job as a clerk and found a room to rent, and he worked for a few months, saved all his money, and then he sailed on a steamer up the Sacramento River to Nevada City, California. And a few miles out of Nevada City, he co-owned a ranch with another man named Robinson. He may have done some mining at the time. There may have been some little gold mines around the area. And he also had the money that he saved from working. But eventually he decided that he did not like the physical labor on the ranch, and that could have something to do with the fact that he was suffering from tuberculosis. And as I go through this, you'll probably forget that Henry was so ill. I think part of Henry was he didn't want people to know. He didn't want to show that he was ill. He didn't want people to know that he was ill. So I believe that even though he may have been suffering, and sometimes maybe more than others, it may have been something where the symptoms kind of came and went on him. But I believe that he actually didn't want people to know that he was ill, especially when he was trying to prove his courage so much. So in 1854, when Henry was 22 years old, he left the ranch and moved to Nevada City. He apprenticed at the United States Bakery, and after a short time had elapsed, he actually bought out one of the owners of the bakery. So now he was a business owner at the age of 22. This is an ad that Henry Plummer wrote up and put in the Nevada Journal newspaper, April 28th, 1854. And I love this. This is a copy of the real ad. He talks about how every article will be manufactured of the very best material with the utmost care, taste, and cleanliness. Remember now, Henry came from the East, and he had some different ideas. And he added some things to the bakery, so he had fruits and vegetables and even cigars. But what's most important is at the bottom, where he put, "Live and let live." I believe that Henry had no intention of making judgments on others. And I believe that he didn't want people to judge him either. So I think that's a real important insight to Henry. Okay, so Henry was 22 years old. He was a business owner. He was young and he was enthusiastic. He was well-educated, intelligent, well-spoken. He had all that going for him. But one thing that he did not have going for him was he was not world-wise. He was still very naive. And this is something that kind of went against the poor guy. It appears that while promoting his business for the bakery with local saloon and brothel owners, that Henry unwittingly acquired some unsavory cohorts. Even saloons back then would provide a free lunch for the guys drinking so that it would keep them in the saloon and keep them drinking. And just like nowadays, if you've ever been to a pub and they've been serving popcorn or peanuts, same as back then in the saloons, they serve salty food to keep the men drinking. And they also would regularly serve one meal a day also. So they could be clients for Henry's bakery, restaurants, the brothels. They could all be clients for Henry for his bakery. So he was like, he was a businessman. He's going to make his business grow and thrive. But he got involved with the wrong kind of people. This is Art Pauley, Henry Plummer, lawman and outlaw. And Art Pauley writes, Henry Plummer had made a mistake and had become indebted to these men to further his own political ambitions. Too late, he had learned that the cost of their services was beyond his ability to pay, and in time would cost him his reputation and eventually his life. And this is really important for what happened. One of the things that happened to Henry that followed him all the way to Montana, and it was like guilt by association. So whenever anything went wrong, Henry was always blamed. And when I was down in Bannack, I was talking to the historian there, John Phillips, and he even mentioned to me, without me saying anything, and he said that anything that ever went wrong, Henry was always blamed. And that's true. And see, he was different too. He was different. He was the odd man out. And now he picked up these unsavory cohorts, and he also had the guilt by association going on. And even though things started out really well for Henry, eventually things kind of went downhill for him. But he became affiliated with the Democratic Party. There were a lot of Democrats out there at the time. And in addition to his nomination for city marshal, he also experienced some political successes and defeats. And he would have gone far probably in politics, but once again, it was the guilt by association that I think kind of killed his political successes back then. But he was elected marshal of Nevada City and on May 9th, 1856, with, of course, the help of these unsavory cohorts. It was very common for saloon owners and gamblers to be involved with local elections in the mining towns. And I read in one book that the saloon owners were actually giving out free drinks to anybody that voted for Henry. So, well, Henry won by a margin of 7 votes, which isn't a lot. But he was the marshal, the city marshal, and he was 24 years old. He had no law enforcement experience or training, but of course, it was a good way for him to prove his courage, of which he was most sensitive, which we already talked about. So Marshal Plumer took his duties very seriously, and he felt responsible for the townspeople. He felt responsible for their well-being and their safety. And he was doing very well. He made many arrests, and one of the Nevada Democrat newspaper wrote that he was the efficient city marshal. He was actually in the newspaper at least once a week, maybe more. He was in the newspaper all the time. In the spring of 1857, Henry was reelected marshal for a second term by a much larger margin. This time it was over 300 votes. So it would seem that part of this was his own doing. I'm sure that the saloon owners and the gamblers and all put their 2 cents in. But it would seem that Henry earned many of these votes by himself because he was such a good marshal at the time. And competent and confident. But now he was still young. He was 25. I guess that's pretty adult age back then, though. But in our standards, it's pretty darn young still. But although he was intelligent and driven, he was still a bit naive to the ways of the world, and sometimes he trusted untrustworthy people. So in the spring of 1857, John and Lucinda Bitter, anybody heard of them? Moved to Nevada City with their baby girl who was ill and frail. They had no place to live, so Marshal Plummer sold them his house. But as we've all heard, no good deed ever goes unpunished, correct? It wasn't long before John Bitter exhibited his habit of viciously abusing Lucinda. He was a gambler, a card dealer, and a heavy drinker, and he was very violent. And at one point, he held a knife to his wife's throat and told her that he was going to kill her. So he was bad news. And so since Lucinda knew of Marshal Plummer and how much he wanted to help the townspeople, she went to the marshal for help, and Henry introduced her to an attorney to begin divorce proceedings. Meanwhile, Lucinda separated from John and took a room with the baby at the Hotel de Paris. Doesn't that look just lovely? And it was well situated because the hotel was right behind the house. So she could actually go back and forth if she wanted to clean up the house or cook John his meals or whatever. But she was basically living with the baby at the hotel. Now, to maintain her safety, Henry and Constable Pat Corbett rented a room right across the hall from Lucinda. Okay, any red flags, anybody? But I am certain that, well, Henry came from the East, Victorian East, and I'm certain that he really wanted to protect her. But other people, and don't forget about his guilt by association, other people may have thought differently with this arrangement. Well, of course, John Bitter was not happy with the marshal's interference in his marriage. Henry tried to get along with John. He turned the other cheek. He figured, well, John had had a difficult life, and that's just the way he was. He was also certain, though, that he knew everything that John said and did, probably with his network of allies and other associates. He probably had a lot of eyes and ears going on around him at the time. And although John made threats throughout the town that he meant to kill the marshal, he even borrowed a loaded pistol from a townsman, Henry assured friends that he would not let John Bitter get the first shot. He probably thought John was all bluster, and this is not going to happen. Well, at midnight on September 25th, Marshal Plummer was on watch at the Bitter home and protecting Lucinda while she waited for John to return to the house with the baby that he had taken away. And Henry sat in a chair next to the stove in the kitchen and covered his eyes when all of a sudden he heard quick ascending footsteps coming up the back steps. John Bitter entered the kitchen. He aimed the loaded pistol at Marshal Plummer and told him that his time had come. It's unclear if he fired or not. In one of the trial testimonies, Lucinda Bitter testified that John Bitter did fire the first shot, but it's very unclear if he did or not. But Henry stood quickly, and he fired 4 shots while advancing on the retreating John Bitter. John Bitter retreated back down the stairs, fell to the ground, and then he died. Marshal Plummer was in shock. This was the first man that he had ever shot. And even though he acted in self-defense, while on duty, he was the marshal, he was the lawman. He immediately took himself to the jail, confessed to shooting John Bitter, said, I don't know if I killed him or not, but I shot him, and he insisted that he be locked in a cell. Over a period of 18 months and the course of 2 trials, he had 2 trials, one in Nevada County and one in Yuba County, Henry was becoming increasingly ill with his tuberculosis. I am currently taking developmental psychology, and in the textbook it explained how stress and the immune system are connected. And I believe this, I've always believed this, and I can imagine the kind of stress that Henry had been going through during these trials and such, and I imagine that it affected his immune system, and the tuberculosis was getting worse. He was almost acquitted on the grounds of self-defense in the second trial, but he had adversaries both times. That's why he had 2 trials, because in both trials he had adversaries on the jury. And with his guilt by association and all, and the situation at the hotel and everything, it was determined to be a case of adultery, and Henry was charged with second-degree murder. He was sentenced to San Quentin State Prison for 10 years, and he entered the prison on February 22nd, 1859. He was 27 years old. And you can't see from the back, but when we're done, you can come on up and take a look at the ledger here from San Quentin Prison, and it describes Henry as we have already described him. Also, Henry had a crippled left hand. His last 3 fingers were permanently curved, and on his index finger, he had a very long scar. So at this point in time, and I don't know what happened or when it happened, but his left hand was permanently crippled as well. During his time in San Quentin, Henry ran errands for the prison physician who believed in his innocence and that he acted in self-defense. The prison physician and the guards at the prison, they knew Henry on an official capacity because Henry, as a marshal, used to bring prisoners to the prison. So they already knew Henry, and they believed in him, they liked him, and they believed in his innocence. So Henry was acted as a trustee of sorts, and he did errands off the grounds for the physician. And one day he was caught in a storm during one of these errands and became extremely ill, which exacerbated his tuberculosis. The prison physician was very alarmed by the severity of Henry's illness, and he believed that Henry only had a few weeks left to live. He wrote to Governor Weller requesting a pardon for Henry. And about that same time, Henry's good friends, good friends, bad friends, sent a petition to Governor Weller on behalf of Henry's innocence, also requesting a pardon. It's so hard to move around with this thing in my ear. But if you can see this is a copy, and there's 2 sides, but I'm not able to turn it over right now. But this is a copy of the petition that was sent to Governor Weller on Henry's behalf. I also have some copies of the letters that the physician and some guards had written to Governor Weller. So Governor Weller pardoned Henry on August 16, 1859, and Henry had been incarcerated for 6 months, but he was actually pardoned because of his failing health. Henry returned to Nevada City on August 26, 1859. Anybody know what this is? Oh, you're reading it. This is the National Exchange Hotel, which is now the National Hotel. It's just been renovated. Still there. It's one of the buildings that survived the Great Fire of 1856. Henry returned to Nevada City, California, and spent roughly a month recovering. I believe that he never got to the point of health that he was before all this happened with John Bader, the trials and the prison sentence. He recovered to some extent, but probably not to where he had been before. He was appointed constable in September 1859 by the man who had replaced him as marshal, and he also believed in Henry, but it was a temporary appointment. I'm sure Henry knew about the petition from Nevada and Nevada County and Yuba County, and probably figured he had a lot of really good friends still in Nevada City, and he returned there. But he was shunned a bit. It was like people didn't really want him to come back. And people had also heard about his tuberculosis in prison, and so nobody would go near him because they didn't want to catch it. So when this was a temporary appointment, being a constable, and when the next election came around, he was out. So was the marshal that had appointed him. They were out. They didn't want any chance of Henry becoming marshal again. And then it's been reported that Henry went into business with another man, possibly the man that he was in business with at the United States Bakery. And then Henry's behavior declined. He began drinking more and gambling and visiting the brothels. If you want my opinion, I believe that Henry had a breakdown of sorts. He was separated from his family. He was all alone. He was very ill, and he went through all this stress with the trials and with being in prison, which I'm sure was not on his agenda when he'd left Maine. And so I think he kind of dropped his basket a bit and maybe had some sort of a breakdown, because this was not Henry's normal behavior. He stayed out of the news stayed, kept low, kept a low profile and stayed out of the news. He had one incident with a man in one of the brothels and Henry had been drinking, and the man interrupted him when he was with a woman, and he hit the man over the head with the butt of his pistol. But other than that, he stayed pretty low until one October evening in 1861 at Irish Maggie's, I love that name, brothel, of course. Henry was involved in a heated argument fueled by alcohol with William Riley. Riley viciously attacked Henry with a knife. He cut clean through his hat and into his scalp and actually into his skull a bit. And with his life threatened once again, Henry shot Riley. Well, back to jail for Henry, only this time he did escape. So if you're all thinking that he escaped from somewhere, it wasn't San Quentin, it was the Nevada City Jail. But it was supposed that his friends actually helped him. It was 3 days after he was arrested, and he simply walked away. And this was under the understanding that he not return to Nevada City. This was 2 men now that he had killed in Nevada City. They did not want him back. So Henry was now an outlaw and a fugitive, so you can all be relieved at that. He fled to Carson City, Nevada, and sought help with William Mayfield. Anybody hear about William Mayfield? Billy Mayfield. Okay. He was a con man and a gambler and somebody that Henry had known from before, and he helped to hide Henry until Henry's head wound healed. And that's another story that's pretty interesting if you ever have time to look that up. It's unclear when Henry left Nevada, but it is suggested that he went to San Francisco and then sailed to Washington and then sailed the Columbia River to Idaho. At any rate, he disappeared over the winter of 1861-62, and there's many rumors and stories and myths about what he was up to during that time when he was gone, that he was in a road agent and robbing wagons and stagecoaches and stuff. But this was a really bad winter, and there was a lot of snow and precipitation, and there was nothing traveling on the roads. In fact, the miners in the smaller mining camps almost starved to death because there were no supplies getting through. So no, there was no road agent activity at that time. If I can find this quickly. Maybe not. Okay. I wanted to read you something, but I can't find it fast enough. Art Pauley had mentioned something that being a robber was not in Henry Plummer's character because he was too intelligent. That's what I wanted to read you, but trust me, it's in the book. So Henry then resurfaced in Lewiston, Idaho in July 1862, and he registered as a single registration at the newly constructed Luna House. And I say single registration because there's another story going around that he registered with redheaded Cynthia. That was not Henry, that was Billy Mayfield. Billy Mayfield, Cherokee Bob, and redheaded Cynthia had a love triangle going on, but it was not Henry. Henry registered by himself. And this was a brand new hotel built and unfortunately is not there anymore. He also met up with some miners of ill repute and participated in gold mining in Florence. And these were probably a lot of the same fellows that from California and all, they just kept going from gold strike to gold strike. And it was a lot of times the same fellows. It's also been reported that Henry staved off a vigilante lynching in Lewiston with an eloquent speech. And he openly spoke out against vigilantism. Henry was in Lewiston for approximately 2 months, from July to September. This is the hotel registry. Close to the bottom on the left is Henry's signature. Now, Henry was an outlaw now and a fugitive, but he was still honest. That's his name, and it's hard to see over on this side, but his hometown, Nevada, California. And before the state of Nevada, Nevada City was just Nevada. So he's got his name, where he's from. It's all out there. It's my opinion that he was pretty honest and that. I mean, he brought himself to jail when he shot John Bader, so that's how I feel. But I think this is pretty. This is actually at the Nez Perce County Historical Museum in Lewiston, Idaho, under glass, of course. Let's see. Did I miss one? Yeah. And that signature of Henry's, I have it also here in one of the displays, and that is the only surviving signature of Henry Plummer as well. But Henry and two mining companions got in a little bit of trouble once again in Orofino. They were at a dance hall and got into a dispute with the dance hall owner. He asked the men to leave, and when they were out at their horses, the dance hall owner came out with two loaded pistols and started shooting at the men. One of the men was injured, and Henry's horse was shot and had to be put down. But at the same time as the man was shooting at the three men all returned fire. Now, the three men all returned fire. Who was blamed for the dance hall owner's death? Any guesses? Henry, of course. Henry was blamed. All right, so Henry then and one of the miners, Charles Reeves, headed east. The other fellow was injured and couldn't go. But Henry and Charles Reeves, they headed east. This is a photograph of the Continental Divide that I thought was pretty cool. All right, so Plummer or Plummer. We're going to take a little break here and discuss the spelling of Henry's name before going on. So his name, the spelling of his name seemed to change following his time in Lewiston, Idaho. Although even back in California, people other than Henry spelled his name both ways. And you can see with the ledgers from San Quentin that they spelled it with two M's. But I like what Frederick Allen said following Henry's time west of the Rockies. He writes, as if to mark his passage into folklore, his name now was typically misspelled with an extra M. And I'm a real stickler about his last name, as you have noticed in the advertisements and everything that's on the PowerPoint. I'm pretty much of a stickler, and I stick with Henry's 1M name. And then you saw the only surviving signature from the Luna House, and also according to Frederick Allen's spelling of Plummer was Henry's surname that he went by as in the family tradition. In September of 1862, Henry and Charles Reeves spent 4 days with the Stewart brothers, James and Grenville Stewart. You all know who they are, right? Okay. Then they split up, and Charles Reeves they were both going to head to Bannack, but Henry changed his mind. So Charles Reeves headed to Bannack, and Henry was headed to Fort Benton. He was going to return to the east. I think he had had enough, and he was still an outlaw and a wanted man. Maybe he didn't want to push his luck. But Henry didn't get back east. His plans were thwarted. He ended up going to Sun River. So this is a picture of Fort Benton in the 1800s. This is another one of my photographic genius, Sun River crossing, because I live near there, so it's very easy to go there and take a snap. But unbeknownst to Henry, he was being followed to Fort Benton by an old nemesis from California who was actually John Farnsworth, and now calling himself Jack Cleveland. Farnsworth had been incarcerated in the Nevada City Jail when Henry was a marshal, and he had a vendetta against Henry. Well, the two ended up at the Sun River Government Farm managed by James Vail. James Vail came west with his wife and 2 children, another friend, Francis Thompson, and a boy, Joseph Swift, were all with them. And, of course, Martha Vail's sister, Electa. We all know who Electa is, or was. Vail was looking to hire men to protect the farm and his family against what he feared was an imminent Blackfeet attack. And it was at Sun River Government Farm that Henry met Electa Bryan, Martha Vail's sister, who would be his future bride. Henry and Electa fell in love, and Henry promised her that he would return in the spring to marry her. Henry and Jack Cleveland left for Bannack in late November, and they arrived in Bannack in late November or early December 1862. Henry was determined to put his California troubles behind him and focus on a new start with Electa. And that's what the funny thing about, or not funny, or sad, or I don't know. Henry Henry kept pushing forward. He just kept going. You know, he got knocked back, and he got up, and he kept going. And so now he's in Bannack, and he's going to turn over a new leaf and start again. He was just always determined. He never gave up. But, of course, you know, there was still Jack Cleveland to contend with, along with the roughs from California and Idaho, who kept showing up, and they were just stuck on him. And also, upon his arrival, it suggested that Henry accepted his grub stake from saloon owner and former acquaintance Cyrus Skinner. And Cyrus Skinner was very disreputable. He also was inmate at San Quentin, but he did escape from San Quentin. And he was a saloon owner, and everywhere he went to any mining camp, he would just set up a saloon. That's kind of what he did. Well, Jack Cleveland was determined to kill Henry in public, and the reason for this was that he needed witnesses. Henry Plummer was known as the fastest draw, and if Jack Cleveland killed Henry without any witnesses, nobody would know that now he was fastest draw. So he needed to prove that he was fastest draw and have witnesses to prove that. So one January day in 1863, Henry was sitting around the stove with others at the Goodrich Hotel saloon, and unfortunately the Goodrich is not there anymore either. And this was when an intoxicated and armed Jack Cleveland arrived. Cleveland was loud and belligerent. He started making accusations about the scoundrels he knew from the other side, which was west of the Rockies, and then how he meant to get his revenge on them. Well, this was a direct threat to Henry's reputation, not to mention Jack's threats on Henry's life. Henry calmly told Jack to calm down and behave himself, and Jack kind of stopped for a few moments, but then he started up again. And when he continued his threats, it would appear that Henry's anger started to finally get the better of him. He'd been dogged by this guy for months, and I think he had really had it as far as he could take it. Jack had been touching his gun all the while, and Henry called for Jack to draw. Even when a man is touching his gun, that's good reason for another man to respond and draw on him, just even touching the gun. But Henry knew that if he could get Jack to draw, then he had every right to shoot him. I don't know if you noticed in your packets, but the California rule, don't draw your gun unless you mean to use it. All right, so Henry shot a warning shot into the ceiling as Jack fumbled for his gun, and then Henry shot Cleveland. Jack fell to his knees, looked up at Henry, and said, "You wouldn't shoot a man when he is down." Well, with a few profane words, Henry said, "Get up." When Jack got to his feet, Henry shot him again. Jack Cleveland had been heavily suspected of committing a murder and robbery shortly after arriving in Bannack with a townsman who had left to check on his livestock, and then a pile of bloody clothes were found, and all of a sudden Jack Cleveland was throwing money around town like crazy. So he was already suspected of committing this crime, and the town really did not like him. Henry was actually acquitted in a minor's trial. It would seem that he did the town a favor dispatching Jack Cleveland. Before Jack Cleveland actually died, though, the town butcher, Hank Crawford, had taken care of him, and Henry was very, very anxious. Now, Henry's turning over a new leaf, right? He's got a fiancée, you know? He doesn't want anything coming out from about what happened back in California. So he was anxious that Cleveland had made an accusatory deathbed statement to Crawford. Henry and Hank Crawford were equally wary of each other. Each thought the other was going to shoot him. And they kind of vacillated between being friends and foes until March of 1863. Henry was standing across the street from the building that Hank had occupied. He had one foot up on a wagon wheel spoke, and his shotgun was across his knee. Hank spotted him across the street there and grabbed his own gun. He went around another building, and he shot Henry from behind, which is pretty cowardly. The ball entered Henry's right elbow and traveled down his wrist, shattering the bones in his arm. Henry stood up straight and shouted, "Some son of a, has shot me." You've probably all heard this story, right? About Henry being shot? Okay. And this is I was fortunate enough to have the image department here at the Historical Society take this picture. This is Henry Plummer's shotgun. It's a muzzle-loading, double-barreled shotgun. It's over 4 feet long, and it's actually under glass right out here in the museum. So if you want to go check that out when we're done here. Severely wounded, Henry turned around and called out to Hank, "Fire away, you cowardly." Hank did shoot again and missed, and then he fled Bannack because he knew that he had to get the heck out of there. Frederick Allen writes, and I love this, "Plummer's show of nerves in standing his ground became the stuff of legend and cemented his reputation for physical courage." I love that. It's great. The surgeon wanted to amputate Henry's arm, but he said he would rather die than lose his arm. He said there was no place on the frontier for a one-armed man. His arm swelled up about 3 times its size, and Henry came down with a very high fever. He nearly did die. Henry now had 2 crippled hands, because we remember from San Quentin's description, his left hand was permanently crippled, and now his right hand from being shot was also affected. Oh, that's a picture of Bannack Main Street that I took myself. I'm such a good photographer. So with this display of courage, Henry was loved, he was respected, and he was feared. He was a perfect choice for sheriff, and he was elected the sheriff of Bannack on May 24th, 1863. He was the sheriff of Bannack and all the surrounding mining camps, so he had a pretty good-sized jurisdiction. 2 days after appointing his deputy, which isn't very long, Henry left for Sun River and his wedding. He was a little bit impetuous. He left on horseback, according to John Phillips, the historian in Bannack. He had left on horseback because it was faster to get up to Sun River, and then purchased a wagon once he got up there, probably in Fort Benton. He also picked up some supplies to bring back for a townsman. Now, that was a very decent thing to do, and I have read in other books as well that Henry did do decent things. Unfortunately, most of these things did not get written down into history. Henry and Electa were married on June 20th, 1863, at the Sun River Government Farm. They were presided over by Father Minutry. I really don't, does anybody know? It sounds like French, and I don't know French. And he came from St. Peter's Mission. This is St. Peter's Mission. They got married on the farm, though, but the priest came from St. Peter's. Henry and Electa arrived back in Bannack and were well received. And I think about their honeymoon, in the wagon coming back from Sun River and sleeping under the stars and all that. How romantic that must have been. But when they returned, there had been some changes. There had been a tragedy, and there had been another gold discovery. When they returned to Bannack, it was almost a ghost town because Alder Gulch had been discovered, and many people from Bannack had left, including Cyrus Skinner, yay. So the tragedy that happened, and you probably are all aware of this, was when Dillingham was shot. Henry had, I believe, 4 deputies, and 2 were reputable and 2 were disreputable. And there was some kind of argument between the deputies, and one of the reputable ones, Dillingham, was shot down in Virginia City. So that was unfortunate, and that happened while Henry Plummer was gone, and Henry Plummer had nothing to do with it. So whatever you read. But as a lawman, Henry believed in due process of the law, and he continued to openly speak out against vigilantism. He solicited a fee of $2.50 from the townspeople, and he built a jail. This is Henry's jail. One of my favorite pictures. If there was a picture of Henry, that would be my favorite picture, but this is as close as I can get. Now, you've probably seen a picture, or you have seen the other jail that's right next door to it with the grass roof, and that one actually was built in the 1870s. But this one is Henry's jail. Sheriff Henry Plummer was well regarded in Bannack, and there was very little crime in the town the summer of 1863, and this is really important to remember. The summer of 1863 was good. He was well regarded, he was respected, he was liked. People went to him with his problems, and he helped them. He did his job as sheriff. But by September 1863, Electa Plummer had apparently become so lonely, waiting long hours for her husband to return home from his duties, that she decided to live with her family back east. The Vales had recently moved to Bannack in order to spend the winter there, but even having her sister nearby did not deter Electa. When Electa left, Henry rode alongside her stagecoach for days. I think he was pretty heartbroken. As Henry lost a wife that September, he also gained a lethal nemesis, and this is where the story veers off from what you all learned. Sidney Edgerton, the appointed Chief Justice of Idaho Territory, was a radical Republican. And remember, this was during the Civil War, 1863, right in the middle of the Civil War, and Sidney Edgerton was a radical Republican. On his way to Lewiston, Idaho, he decided not to continue his journey due to the approaching winter. Instead, he ended up in Bannack. He was supposed to go to Lewiston to be sworn in, but decided not to go that far. Edgerton was joined by his wife and family, as well as his nephew Wilbur Fisk Sanders and his family. And as I mentioned, the Civil War was raging back east, and Edgerton was on a mission. Edgerton was on a mission. As liquid assets such as gold were important to the political strength of both the Union and the Confederacy, it was Sidney Edgerton's task to secure that flow of gold from Bannack and Virginia City to the Union in order to assure victory for the North. Edgerton took advantage of every opportunity to accomplish his mission, no matter how ruthless. As a radical Republican, he viewed Democrats as traitors, and there happened to be very many Democrats in that area, including the local sheriff. Bannack's Democratic sheriff, Henry Plummer, became Edgerton's prime target. The situation in Bannack and Virginia City was tailor-made for Edgerton and his undertaking. He very likely used the momentum of the social dynamics in the newly established mining towns, along with the associations between the roughs and Sheriff Plummer, plus Henry's soiled past, as a way to succeed in his mission. It just all kind of worked for him. It was a package of dynamite next to a fire, and it just needed a little shove. Several articles agree that Montana gold helped the Union win the Civil War. I don't know if any of you are familiar with John Fazio. He is a historian that he focuses on the Civil War and all aspects of the Civil War. And much of the information that I have retrieved is from John Fazio's articles. Now remember, Sheriff Henry Plummer had been well-liked and respected up until this time, and there was very little crime in Bannack until after Edgerton's arrival. There was little crime in Bannack until stagecoach holdups began in October 1863, 1 month following the arrival of Sidney Edgerton and Wilbur Sanders. The holdups, there were only 3, were bungled, not organized, and they were carried out by 2 or 3 men, not a large band. And no one was killed during these holdups. In fact, only 1 man was shot and injured, and that was one of the robbers. Rumors and fears spread quickly through the mining towns of Bannack and Virginia City as stories of crime became exaggerated. Rumors have to be started by someone. I wonder who started the rumors. Sheriff Plummer became the focus of suspicions and tall tales in connection with a supposed band of road agents. According to Mather and Boswell, who are also historians and historical writers, say that the idea of a gang with Plummer at its head may have come originally from Sanders. I actually think it came from above Sanders. I think maybe it came from Edgerton. Wilbur Sanders was Sidney Edgerton's nephew, and he was very willing to do his uncle's bidding because he wanted to further his own political career. He was a lawyer, but he wanted to further his political career. And possibly by doing his uncle's bidding, that would help him with that. In December 1863, a man named George Ives was put on trial for an isolated murder, and Wilbur Sanders was the prosecuting attorney. Does everybody recall George Ives? Okay, and there really wasn't a lot of concrete evidence, but the jury came back unanimous, all but one, and an agitated Wilbur Sanders, on his own accord, decided that the majority vote would rule, and Ives was sentenced and hanged. Done. No doubt, acting on Edgerton's authority, Wilbur Sanders instigated the formation of the Montana Vigilantes, and on December 23rd, 1863, the Montana Vigilantes were officially formed in Virginia City, with Wilbur Sanders as one of the founders. Theoretically, the vigilantes had a questionable list of supposed road agents, naming Sheriff Plummer as their leader, that they had obtained from a man who they summarily hanged. Who was that man? Red Yeager. Yeah. Yep, and they badgered him, and he told them something, but nobody really knows what he told the vigilantes because they hanged him and silenced him permanently. A vigilante assemblage was already partially formed in Bannack at the time by the resident Masons. Most of the vigilantes were either Republicans and or Masons. And the Virginia City Committee went to Bannack to solidify their plans, beginning with the hanging of Sheriff Plummer. Now this just all worked out, right? Because Edgerton's main goal, getting the flow of gold to the Union, in order to do that, he had to eliminate the Democrats, because he was afraid that the Democrats in town were going to get the gold to the South, to the Confederacy, and he didn't want that to happen. So this is just working out really well. Now he's using the vigilantes as a tool. As of the winter of 1863-64, Henry may have been increasingly ill with his tuberculosis. Remember, he's sick, right? On Sunday night, January 10th, 1864, 3 vigilante squads were sent out, 1 for each of the sheriffs, 2 deputies, and 1 for the sheriff. Henry had been ill for several days, and he was resting at his sister-in-law's home when the vigilante squad came for him. But he assured his concerned sister-in-law that it had something to do with a prisoner in town and not to worry, and he left with the men. But when the nefarious vigilante scheme regarding the fate of Henry and his 2 deputies became clear to him, Henry called out, "You men know us better than this." Well, that stopped the vigilantes in their tracks. Henry's the sheriff. Henry's the law. What are they doing? So they stopped. They paused. Well, Wilbur Sanders, who lived next door to the Vales, was hiding out in his cabin. It was all dark, and he was hiding out. Well, he saw what was going on, and he poked his head out the door and ordered, "Company, forward march." So the roughs, mostly Democrats, and accused of exaggerated villainy, were systematically eliminated, including the lawfully elected sheriff. 21 men lost their lives during the lynching spree of that winter of 1863-64. According to Edgerton's mission, with the removal of the local Democrats, the flow of gold to the South would halt, and the Union victory would result by means of constant gold supply from Virginia City. And Bannack, too, and I didn't capitalize city there. Sorry about that. Before he was hanged, Henry asked for a fair trial and was denied. Resigned to his fate, Henry asked for a good job. He did not get a good job. Henry and his deputies died by strangulation, as the noose was placed around their necks and they were hoisted off the ground. Sidney Edgerton became the first governor of Montana Territory and is heralded in history as a hero. Henry Plummer lost his life and went down in history as the Outlaw Sheriff of Bannack. This is a picture of Henry Plummer's grave. If you remember my mentioning Francis Thompson, who was a friend of the Vales, who came west with them on the same steamer and was supposedly a friend of Henry's. Actually, he and Henry took meals at the Vales. Martha would cook for them. And Sunday morning, Francis Thompson and Henry Plummer had breakfast together. And Francis Thompson knew what was going to happen and never said a word. So he had Henry's coffin built and paid for it with Henry's own funds. But as you can see where Henry was buried, this doesn't look like a cemetery. Henry was not allowed a plot on Cemetery Hill. Now remember the summer of 1863? Things were great. He was respected. Now they hated him, and they wouldn't even allow him a plot on Cemetery Hill. What happened? Something or someone, in my mind, intervened. The next spring following Sheriff Plummer's death, a letter arrived in Bannack. It was an official notification approving Henry's application for Deputy U.S. Marshal that Henry had forwarded on to Washington. Had he lived, Henry Plummer would have been the first U.S. Marshal of Idaho Territory. Any guess who did get to be the U.S. Deputy Marshal? John X. Beadler, the sadistic hangman. Yep. Oop. References. And this is the picture that you have in your packet of Henry. It's a drawing by C.M. Callison Diaz, and it's in a couple of the Mather and Boswell books, Vigilante Victims and Hanging the Sheriff. This is a poem that I wrote. I won't read it to you. You can read it yourself if you want to. So, how do you guys feel? Are y'all certain now that Henry Plummer was the criminal mastermind of a band of road agents? Are you thinking? Are you processing? I hope that you read your packets. There's a lot of excerpts and information. There's a book list in there if you want to do your own research. And otherwise, if you have any questions, that's it. Yes? Did he have a religion? I don't know. I think he was a Christian, but I'm not sure. Yes, but that may have been because of the veils. And the veils were not Catholic. They were waiting for their own minister who never made it because he never made it on the steamer. So they were probably Protestant. Yes.
Bill's husband was at the Sun River Ranch.
Okay, right.